She will sit next to me.
The Lee Corporation lobby wasn't just the heart of a powerful multinational. It was a living reflection of a society that transformed status into a sentence, appearance into judgment, and fragility into spectacle. Every corner of that reception area shone not only with impeccable cleanliness, but with the sharp gaze of those who believed they had the right to measure someone's worth by the cut of their suit or the heel of their sandals. And it was precisely into this stifling environment that Han Soo-jin entered, clutching to her chest an old, weather-beaten folder that held not just a simple resume, but the weight of all her last hopes. Her face, worn from sleepless nights caring for her sick mother, still bore the determination of someone who had sworn to herself she wouldn't go home without trying. Each step toward the counter was a silent statement of courage, even knowing the ground she walked on wasn't made for people like her. As soon as she handed her resume to the receptionist, the world seemed to stop for a second. The mocking look, the lopsided smile, and the suppressed laugh were the first blows. But what came next was even crueler. Do you really think anyone here would hire someone like you? The words bounced off the glass walls like a definitive sentence, and like a perverse script came the snickers, the venomous whispers, the looks of contempt disguised as curiosity. Soo-jin remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the floor, fighting the urge to disappear. But something inside her refused to break. That pain, though familiar, would not define her. What no one knew was that, at that very moment, someone was watching everything, someone who wouldn't tolerate injustice in silence. The company's CEO, a man known for his coolness and impartiality, was watching the scene from the top of the glass staircase. And with a single gesture, he was about to turn the key to a fate everyone believed was sealed. If this scene has you hooked so far, please subscribe. And leave a like. It shows me that you want to see where this story goes. In that moment when silence hung heavy over the hall, as if the air were suspended between shame and expectation, the mind of Han Soo-jin took refuge in memories that had shaped her until that moment. Growing up in the narrow alleys of Busan, where the smell of fresh fish from the market mingled with the constant sound of waves crashing against the rocks, she had learned early on that life wasn't easy. As a girl, she'd seen her mother sewing late into the night, her eyes tired but always accompanied by an encouraging smile. When that fragile woman's health began to fail, Soo-jin realized that childhood was over before she even understood what lightness meant. At 16, she began dividing her days between studies and temporary jobs. She served tea in traditional tea houses, cleaned offices where no one remembered to thank her, and sometimes faced similar humiliations to the one she now experienced at Lee Corporation. But what sustained her was her younger brother, Han Jun-ho, just 13 years old, who still believed that her sister was capable of transforming reality. It was for him that she kept her hand-me-down books. It was for him that she smiled, even when she came home with calloused hands. Despite her poverty, Soo-jin never stopped believing there was dignity in trying. She knew her simple clothes wouldn't shine like the expensive gowns of the women at the reception, but she carried in her heart a determination no luxury fabric could buy. It was this silent flame that made her wake up early, put on her best blouse, albeit threadbare, and cross the city to try once again for a better future. As she waited for someone to take her resume forward, her stomach churned with nervousness, but there was also a glimmer of hope. Deep down, she believed that if she had just the chance to speak, her voice would reveal more than just the yellowed papers of years of failed attempts. But in that cold environment where appearance seemed to be worth more than character, her hope was crushed with every laugh that echoed against her. And yet, there was something in her gaze that wouldn't be extinguished, a restrained courage, almost invisible. but perceptible to those who knew how to look beyond the surface. Fate was about to bring her face to face with someone who would see that flame, someone who, at that very moment, was already watching silently, about to change the course of her life in ways she couldn't even imagine. The worn paste was still firm between his fingers. Han Soo-jin, but her confidence began to slip under the receptionist's mocking gaze. The woman, with impeccable red lipstick and heels that clicked as if to mark her territory, held the resume dismissively, waving the paper as if it were worthless. The silence that fell over the lobby was broken by her venom-laced voice. Do you really think that, with that weak resume and that appearance, anyone in this building would take you seriously? The laughter that followed wasn't just hers. Other employees, drawn by the cruel spectacle, swarmed like birds of prey surrounding wounded prey. One, twirling her shiny hair, added, "Maybe she got lost along the way. She must have mistaken Lee Corporation for a cleaning factory." Laughter echoed, each one like an invisible knife piercing Soo-jin's dignity. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the polished floor that reflected her own vulnerability. Inside, she wanted to disappear, wanted the world to swallow that moment, but her mind screamed for her mother's face, fragile on the bed, and her brother's innocent smile. It was for them that she had to resist. Her heart was pounding so hard it felt like everyone could hear it, but she didn't allow a single tear to escape. She wouldn't give that pleasure to someone who humiliated her. The comments continued. Another employee who had been merely observing decided to add, "Did she come here? Asking for a job or arms? Because the difference in here is stark." With each word, the lobby filled with cruelty. People who could have simply ignored it chose to participate in the silent massacre, demonstrating that, in this place, compassion was as rare as gold. Soo-jin tried, with a trembling voice, to simply ask them to forward her resume to the appropriate department, but her request was met with even more mockery. Forward it, and stain the director's desk with this dull paper. "Oh, please," the receptionist said, tearing open the envelope containing the document. The sound of the paper ripping was like a thunderclap that echoed inside her. The silence that followed brought no relief. It was the silence of curious eyes, of people waiting to see how far this humiliating scene would go. Some masked discomfort, others laughed openly, but everyone remained still, as if this spectacle were part of their routine. In that moment, Soo-jin felt the weight of loneliness. She faced an army of judgments, armed only with her quiet courage. She held her hands tightly to keep them from shaking, took a deep breath, and lifted her chin for the first time, showing that, even wounded, she would not be destroyed so easily. And it was precisely at that moment, when the air seemed charged with cruelty and her strength was about to break, that firm footsteps began to echo through the lobby. A deep, rhythmic sound that seemed to displace the air around it. No one knew who was approaching. Yet but that strong, confident beat carried a presence that would change everything. The footsteps echoing in the lobby did not belong to an ordinary visitor. There was a firmness to them that demanded respect, even before the owner was seen. Gradually, the figure of Lee Ji-hoon, CEO of Lee Corporation, came into view, wearing an impeccably tailored suit that reflected not only wealth, but natural authority. He walked serenely, his gaze serious and attentive, as if every detail around him were being silently recorded. The nearby staff members quickly noticed his presence and hurriedly bowed, trying to hide their embarrassment at witnessing the cruel scene against Soo-jin. However, Ji-hoon wasn't distracted by bows or superficial greetings. His eyes immediately fixed on the plainly dressed young woman who remained motionless, trying to compose herself after the humiliation. The contrast couldn't have been starker. On one side, the most influential man in the building, a symbol of power and success. On the other, a humble girl with a crumpled resume in her hands and tears welling up in her eyes. But it was precisely this contrast that captured Ji-hoon's attention. He didn't just see fragility in Soo-jin. There was a quiet strength that manifested itself in the way she remained standing, even after being ridiculed in front of everyone. As he walked slowly toward the reception, Ji-hoon heard snatches of mockery still lingering in the air. The staff, unaware of who was, approaching, continued to smile sarcastically, satisfied with crushing the hopes of someone who had dared to dream beyond their means. But Ji-hoon didn't rush to intervene. He observed every gesture, every word, as if intent on imprinting the scene on his memory. His silence was heavy, laden with an invisible authority that began to permeate the room. Gradually, the laughter died away, replaced by an unease no one could explain. There was something in his gaze that conveyed not only judgment, but also contained indignation. Soo-jin, without fully raising her eyes, noticed someone different in the room, a presence altering the air, but she didn't dare believe it was anyone important. The seconds stretched out like minutes, and everyone in the lobby began to sense something unusual was about to happen. Ji-hoon was already standing in front of the receptionist, who finally looked up and paled as she recognized the man who led the entire corporation. And it was at that moment that fate decided to move forward. The silence that preceded his words was merely the prelude to a turn of events no one would have dared imagine. The entire lobby seemed to freeze the instant his eyes met hers. Lee Ji-hoon found those of Han Soo-jin. There was no word, no announcement, just that steady gaze filled with a silent intensity, piercing the young woman as if searching for answers hidden in her soul. It was the kind of silence that spoke louder than any speech, heavy enough to make everyone hold their breath. Soo-jin, still trembling, couldn't understand why that imposing man was watching her so intently. Her instincts told her to lower her head again, but something inside her, perhaps pride, perhaps weariness from always shrinking, made her hold his gaze for a few seconds. And in that brief encounter, Ji-hoon didn't just see a humiliated girl, he saw hidden courage, a nearly invisible flame that persisted even when everything around her seemed intent on extinguishing it. The employees, previously full of laughter, were now speechless. Some looked at each other, trying to hide the growing dread as they realized the CEO himself had witnessed every word of mockery. The mood that had been one of cruel amusement just seconds before had turned to absolute embarrassment. Ji-hoon, however, didn't break the silence with immediate reprimands. Instead, he remained still, studying the scene like someone judging a painting on display. His mind flashed back to distant memories of when, as a young man, he too had had to fight against scornful looks and doors that had been closed simply because he hadn't been born with the right surname. Perhaps that was why the discomfort in his chest was so intense. He saw in Soo-jin a distorted reflection of his own history. The air felt too heavy to breathe. Every second that passed heightened the anticipation of what he would do next. No one dared move. No one dared speak. It was as if the lobby had become a silent courtroom, and Ji-hoon was the judge about to decide the fate not only of Soo-jin, but also of the reputations of everyone who had chosen to laugh at her. And then, unhurriedly, Ji-hoon took a step forward, enough to make every person's heart race. His lips parted slightly, announcing that the first words were about to be spoken, words that would completely change the course of that morning. The dense silence that hung over the lobby was finally broken by the firm voice of Lee Ji-hoon. There was no need to shout, because his authority was already present in every syllable. He stared at the receptionist, who was now trembling before him, and then back at Han Soo-jin, still teary-eyed. "She's not going to the interview line," he declared, his tone grave and unchanging. "She's going to sit next to me." The sentence fell like a thunderclap in the middle of the room. For a few seconds, no one dared react. It was as if everyone was trying to process what they had just heard. The receptionist, previously haughty and cruel, immediately paled, her lips trembling, unable to form a response. The giggles that had previously echoed turned into embarrassed silence, and whispers spread among those present like an uncontainable wildfire. Soo-jin, for her part, felt her legs tremble. She wasn't sure if she'd understood correctly, wasn't sure if what she'd heard was a figment of her imagination. The most important man in the company had interrupted an entire scene of humiliation just to defend her. Disbelief mixed with fear, and hope, forming a whirlwind that prevented her from moving a muscle. Ji-hoon walked over to her and held out his hand, helping her to stand. The simple gesture seemed to carry the weight of unexpected justice. Hesitantly, Soo-jin accepted, and his firm touch restored a strength she'd thought she'd lost. The entire room watched, unable to comprehend how a scorned candidate had become, in a matter of seconds, the most important person in the room. The scene's repercussions were reflected in the nervous looks on the employees' faces. Some were already murmuring among themselves, wondering why the CEO would do this. Others simply watched, aware that any reaction could be interpreted as disrespectful. The receptionist, trying to compose herself, stammered some kind of apology, but Ji-hoon paid her no attention. His posture made it clear that the authority was not open to questioning. Leading Soo-jin by the arm, he advanced toward the main elevator. The sound of footsteps echoed as if an announcement that something extraordinary had happened. The doors opened, and the silence in the lobby remained suffocating, as if everyone was still gripped by the scene that had just unfolded before them. Soo-jin, still speechless, looked around as if trying to capture every detail of that moment. It wasn't just a change of scenery, but a turning point. Just minutes ago, she'd been the butt of laughter. Now she was being led by the corporation president himself. The mix of emotions almost made her believe she was in a dream from which she didn't want to wake up. Ji-hoon remained serious, without revealing what was going on in his mind. For him, that gesture wasn't just an impulsive defense. It was an acknowledgement of something greater, an instinct that told him this young woman had more to offer than anyone there imagined. His eyes remained watchful, and even if he didn't show it, he had already decided that from then on, no one would dare treat her as inferior. The elevator. Doors slowly closed, and the instant the metallic clang echoed, a collective gasp filled the lobby. It was as if everyone was finally allowed to breathe. However, the consequences of that act were only just beginning, and none of those present could have predicted what would come next. The elevator had closed, but the lobby remained in shock. The words of Lee Ji-hoon still echoed in everyone's mind. "She will sit next to me." It was as if the air was thick with that unexpected statement, and no one could immediately return to their routine. The employees who had been laughing minutes before now looked away, embarrassed, pretending to be busy with paperwork or computer screens. However, the blush on their faces betrayed their collective embarrassment. The receptionists who had led the humiliation seemed ready to break down. The main one, the one who had ripped open Soo-jin's envelope, was trying her best to compose herself, but the tremor in her hands was visible. She mumbled apologies under her breath, as if trying to justify the unjustifiable to her colleagues, but none of them dared agree. They all knew they had crossed a line from which there was no going back. Whispers began to ripple through the room like discreet waves. "Did you hear what he said?" one employee asked quietly. "I've never seen the president intervene like that. Who could that girl be?" another retorted. Curiosity mingled with astonishment, and Soo-jin's name, previously unknown, began to circulate among those who had previously despised her. To some, the CEO's gesture seemed inexplicable, almost a sudden whim. To others, it was proof that Ji-hoon had seen something everyone else had ignored. But regardless of interpretations, one certainty lingered. Soo-jin's life would never be the same again. The exchanged glances were filled with speculation. Who was she? Where did she come from? And why had she been chosen by the CEO himself? The questions remained suspended, fueling an atmosphere of mystery that only grew. With each passing second, the initial humiliation seemed to give way to a new narrative where the simple young woman became the protagonist of a story no one would dare interrupt. And as the chatter raged in the hallways, an uneasy feeling spread among those who had laughed the loudest. Fear of reprisals consumed them, knowing that if Ji-hoon decided to act, their careers could be at risk. The humiliation they had inflicted was backfiring on them, becoming a burden they would now carry in the days to come. The lobby, once a scene of mockery, became the starting point for a rumor that would spread throughout the corporation. And while each employee struggled to find explanations for the president's gesture, Soo-jin and Ji-hoon were already on their way to a conversation that would change not only her life, but the fate of the entire company. The elevator doors opened on the top floor of the Lee Corporation, revealing a quiet and sophisticated environment, a far cry from the heavy atmosphere Soo-jin had encountered minutes earlier. The carpeted corridors muffled the sound of footsteps, and the glass walls allowed the sole light to illuminate every detail of the modern architecture. It was a space reserved only for the company's top management, where few dared enter. Lee Ji-hoon, he walked beside Soo-jin with firm steps, exuding calm and authority. She, in turn, followed hesitantly, still not understanding why she was there. Her heart raced as if trying to escape her chest, and with each step, her thoughts torn between gratitude and disbelief. Why would he do that for me? The question repeated itself in his mind without finding an answer. When they reached the president's office, Ji-hoon opened the door and made a polite gesture inviting her in. The space was spacious, decorated with elegant but uncluttered furniture, conveying a sobriety that reflected the owner himself. He indicated the armchair in front of his desk, and in a respectful tone, said, "Sit down." Soo-jin obeyed silently, her hands still trembling in her lap. Ji-hoon then poured 2 glasses of water, handing one to her. The simple gesture disarmed her. It wasn't the treatment she expected from someone with so much power. "Did you know I was listening to everything?" he asked, leaning on the table, his eyes never leaving hers. Soo-jin swallowed hard before answering, "No, I just wanted a chance to be heard. Nothing more." There was sincerity in her voice, an honesty that contrasted with the power games Ji-hoon was accustomed to facing in his daily life at the corporation. He watched her silently, analyzing not only her words, but also the firmness with which, even when humiliated, she maintained her dignity. "Chance," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. "Sometimes that's all a person needs to show who they really are." Soo-jin lowered her eyes, trying to contain the emotion that threatened to overflow. In that instant, she realized that it wasn't just her life that was changing, but also the way someone powerful had chosen to view it. The conversation continued in hushed tones, but charged with meaning. Ji-hoon asked questions about her background, her family in Busan, and the odd jobs she'd held. And the more she talked, the more he became convinced there was something special about this young woman. It wasn't her resume or her looks. It was something deeper, an invisible strength that only revealed itself when tested by adversity. However, even as the two shared that unexpected moment of closeness, the buzz was already spreading throughout the company. Comments, criticism, and even accusations were beginning to form, and Ji-hoon's decision would not go unnoticed. His kindness had shed light on Soo-jin, but with that light would also come shadows of distrust and even greater challenges. While the conversation between Lee Ji-hoon and Han Soo-jin was happening behind the closed doors of the presidential office, on other floors of the corporation, a whirlwind of rumors was spreading. What had begun as a humiliating episode in the reception area now became an unwritten headline, passed from mouth to mouth with the fervor of someone who had witnessed the impossible. The president took that girl to his office. He said she'll sit next to him. Who is she, anyway? The questions swirled, and each version seemed more distorted than the last. The senior directors, men accustomed to deciding who deserved to be in or out of the company, looked at each other suspiciously. To them, the president's move seemed like an unnecessary risk. How could someone with no prestigious background, no powerful recommendations, and no appearance that met corporate standards suddenly have direct access to the heart of the leadership? Inside meetings, comments piled up. Ji-hoon is acting on impulse. He can't tarnish the company's image because of an outsider. Among the employees who had participated in the humiliation, fear mixed with anger. The head receptionist, now feeling the threat of being exposed, began to devise excuses. It was a misunderstanding, she told her colleagues, trying to hide her nervousness. Deep down, however, she was already looking for ways to make Soo-jin a target again, fearing that her own position would be questioned. Inside the room, Ji-hoon realized the weight his decision was beginning to carry. While he had no doubt he'd done the right thing, he knew the coming days would be marked by judgmental stares and internal resistance. The Lee Corporation was an empire built on tradition, and any deviation from the norm was seen as a threat. Soo-jin, sitting across from him, also felt the invisible pressure. She could almost hear the whispers coming through the walls. She knew that to many, she was already considered an outsider, someone who didn't belong in this world of gleaming glass and impeccable suits. Her breathing grew heavy whenever she imagined the judgment to come. Ji-hoon then leaned forward slightly and said in a serious tone, "It won't be easy. Many will question your presence here, but if you resist, you'll prove them wrong from the start." The words, though firm, were also a reminder of the battle yet to come. Soo-jin nodded silently, feeling that this was only the beginning of a tortuous path. And indeed, the first tests came quickly. Documents were handed to her to organize, but purposefully shuffled to make her appear incompetent. Directors treated her with veiled disdain, ignoring her presence in important discussions. Malicious glances even circulated through the hallways, as if everyone was waiting for the moment she would fail. Yet amidst the traps, Soo-jin maintained the same quiet strength that had caught Ji-hoon's attention. While outwardly she trembled, inwardly she held firm. Each task completed was a silent response to those who wanted to see her fall. Still, the pressure mounted. The environment seemed to conspire against her, and even Ji-hoon, despite silently defending her, knew it would only be a matter of time before the first definitive proof would come. A situation in which no one could deny the value she hid, or in which everyone would be confirmed that they were right in rejecting her. The days that followed were of constant tension within the Lee Corporation. Every step of Han Soo-jin was watched as if she were part of a silent spectacle, where everyone waited anxiously for the moment she would stumble. There were those who reveled in the anticipation of her fall, and there were also those who simply watched in silence, intrigued by her decision to lead Ji-hoon off, bringing her so close to you. For Soo-jin, however, each morning was a new challenge. Waking up early, dressing with the same simplicity that distinguished her, taking a deep breath and facing the judgmental looks that seemed to pierce her skin. The first tasks she was given were deliberately tricky. She received documents with conflicting information, incomplete reports, and absurdly short deadlines, all designed to expose her supposed incompetence. But instead of backing down, Soo-jin sought strategies no one expected. With patience and intelligence, she began organizing the papers, cross-referencing data, and finding errors that even experienced directors had missed. Soon, previously confusing reports gained clarity and logic in her hands. Ji-hoon, even without openly showing it, followed every detail. He watched from afar how she handled hostility, how she transformed obstacles into small, silent victories. With each report she delivered, he saw confirmed the intuition he'd had from the beginning. There was raw talent in Soo-jin, a rare determination not found in prestigious degrees or prominent surnames. Some employees began to notice, too. The initial buzz, which called her an intruder, gave way to quiet comments of admiration. She actually managed to solve this? No one had noticed this mistake before. Gradually, the narrative began to shift, and those who had been waiting for her defeat began to feel the threat that instead of falling, she might shine. Despite her progress, Soo-jin remained insecure. She knew she still had much to prove, and that any slip-up could cost her dearly. But each night, when she came home exhausted and looked at her mother's tired smile and her brother's hopeful gaze, she found renewed strength. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for them. And that made her unbeatable. Ji-hoon, realizing how dedicated she was, began giving her more space. Small opportunities in internal meetings, brief conversations where I'd ask her opinion. Each time she spoke, Soo-jin revealed a sharp wit, surprising even those who'd previously mocked her. She was no longer just the humiliated girl at the reception desk. He was becoming someone whose voice carried weight. And it was precisely this new stance that paved the way for the next big moment. A crucial meeting was about to take place, bringing together the entire board and some of the company's most important investors. There, in front of everyone, Soo-jin would have the opportunity, or the risk, to definitively show who she was. The morning of the great meeting dawned full of expectation within the Lee Corporation. It was the monthly meeting with key directors and investors, a time when strategic decisions shaped the company's future. The corridors were buzzing with murmurs, and eyes, as always, turned to Han Soo-jin, the young woman who still seemed out of place in that environment of expensive suits and imported perfumes. Many believed that this would be the day she would finally expose herself to ridicule. Unable to sustain the position the president himself had granted her, others silently waited only to see how far the courage of this woman who seemed to have come from another world would go. The meeting room was impeccably organized, with a long glass table and symmetrically arranged chairs. In the center, Lee Ji-hoon. He was already waiting, with his characteristic serene posture, but with a watchful gaze that observed every detail. Soo-jin, positioned discreetly in a corner, felt the weight of all the gazes piercing her like invisible blades. Her breathing was controlled, but inside, a whirlwind of emotions threatened to shatter her outward calm. The first few minutes were dominated by technical reports and figures projected on the screen. More experienced directors took turns presenting data and forecasts, always careful to demonstrate their competence in front of the president. When one of the investors raised a question about financial inconsistencies in one of the projects, the room fell into a brief, awkward silence. It was a sensitive issue, and the directors looked at each other, unable to provide a satisfactory answer. At that moment, as if courage had welled up from a hidden place within her, Soo-jin gently raised her hand. The entire room turned. To her, some in astonishment, others in contempt. Ji-hoon watched her silently, allowing her to continue. In a firm voice, though her heart was pounding, she explained that she had reviewed the reports and found errors that had gone unnoticed for months. In clear, objective detail, she demonstrated how numbers were being incorrectly inflated and proposed simple adjustments that could save the company millions. The impact was immediate. Investors who had previously barely glanced at her now leaned forward, hanging on her every word. Directors frowned, some in embarrassment, others in indignation at having been outmaneuvered by someone considered an intruder. The initial silence gave way to murmurs of surprise. One of the directors, overcome with wounded pride, tried to ridicule the intervention. It's easy to point out problems when you don't understand the complexities of management, he said acidly. But before he could continue, Ji-hoon interrupted him with the firmness of someone who wouldn't tolerate injustice. Enough. Her voice echoed through the room like a well-aimed blow. If there's anyone here who demonstrated clarity, competence, and courage, it was her. While many settled for mistakes, she found solutions. And let me make it clear, as long as I'm CEO of this company, no one will have the right to humiliate anyone who deserves respect. The weight of her words fell upon everyone like a sentence. The receptionist, who had been discreetly summoned to assist with the meeting, lowered her head, unable to meet the president's gaze. The directors shifted in their seats, and the investors, pleased with Soo-jin's intervention, nodded, approving her analysis. Soo-jin, overcome with emotion, held back tears. She wasn't crying just because she'd been heard, but because she felt, for the first time, that her voice had real value, that her presence wasn't a mistake, but a choice of fate. Ji-hoon looked at her with an expression that mixed pride and certainty, as if confirming to everyone that his intuition had always been correct. The mood in the room had changed. The humiliated young woman at the reception desk was now the loudest voice among all the executives, and no one dared to challenge her. But as the meeting ended and the quiet applause echoed through the room, a new path began to form, one that would extend far beyond the walls of that company. When the meeting ended, the mood inside the Lee Corporation was no longer the same. The name of Han Soo-jin, once a laughingstock for many, had become a symbol of courage and competence. But for her, the transformation still seemed unreal. Her steps were hesitant as she left the meeting room, as if she feared that at any moment someone might tell her it had all been a passing dream. However, every glance she met was different now. There was no more laughter, no more mockery. There was respect, and in some, even admiration. Lee Ji-hoon walked beside her in silence. His firm posture, his gaze ahead, revealed the seriousness of someone who knew exactly the weight of his choices. As they passed through the company lobby, where days before Soo-jin had been humiliated, everyone bowed discreetly, in reverence not only to the president, but also to the young woman he had elevated before everyone. For her, the contrast was so great that her heart almost broke. She remembered the torn envelope, the malicious laughter, and now she realized that, in less than a week, that very place had become the stage for her redemption. Outside, the city air felt fresher, as if even Seoul welcomed her differently. Ji-hoon stopped in front of the main entrance, turned to her, and studied her for a moment. There was no rush in his words, but when he spoke, his voice carried the gravity of someone who doesn't waste his gestures. "I didn't bring you here just to be an employee," he said, his tone mixing firmness with a vulnerability rare in his appearance. "I brought you here because I believe destiny made me hear your voice." Soo-jin felt her eyes sting, but she didn't cry. She didn't want that moment to be marked by weakness, but rather by the certainty that her life had just taken an irreversible turn. The busy streets around her seemed to disappear, and all that remained was the intensity of that moment. Ji-hoon extended his hand, and for a few seconds she hesitated, still frightened by the enormity of everything that was happening. But when she finally took it, she felt as if the weight of the past few years had dissolved. It wasn't just a gesture of rapprochement. It was a silent pact, an announcement that from then on they would no longer be on opposite sides of the social hierarchy. Something greater was being born, something that transpired between the barriers imposed by a society that so often judged by the exterior and forgot the value of the interior. As they walked together, camera flashes began to appear in the distance. Journalists who had been discreetly following the CEO's steps were now recording the scene, and soon the image would spread across the news and social media. The story of the humiliated young woman who had earned not only a position in the company, but also the president's attention would spread like wildfire, inspiring many and disturbing just as many. Ji-hoon seemed indifferent to the flashes. His focus was solely on Soo-jin, who, even embarrassed by the exposure, felt strangely protected by his side. They walked to the official company car, but before they got in, he leaned in slightly and whispered, "This is just the first page of our story." The impact of those words reverberated within her like a call. The journey wasn't over. On the contrary, it was just beginning. The dinner they would have that night wouldn't just be a meal, but a milestone that would forever change the way they both viewed their destination. The car doors closed, and as the vehicle drove away, the Lee Corporation building remained. Behind like a monument of memories, the very place that had witnessed her humiliation was now also proof of her victory. Soo-jin leaned her head against the window, her eyes lost in the city lights, and felt, for the first time in a long time, that there was hope not just for survival, but for truly living. And so, the young woman who had arrived with a crumpled resume and plain clothes, humiliated in front of everyone, now left alongside the most powerful man in the company. Not as a charity case, but as someone who had earned, with dignity and courage, the respect everyone believed impossible. If this story moved you and made you believe again that justice and true love still exist, subscribe to the channel right now. Like it, share it with someone who also needs to hear this message, and stay tuned for our next stories, because, believe me, what comes next will be even more surprising.